On the gleaming tarmac of JFK, the flagship of Global Atlantic Airways, Flight 110 to London, stood as a monument to modern engineering and luxury. In its cockpit sat Captain Mark Jensen, a man at the pinnacle of his career, a pilot whose confidence bordered on outright arrogance. As the first-class passengers boarded, a quiet, elderly black man in a simple tweed jacket caught his eye. A flicker of amusement, a whispered venomous remark to his co-pilot, and a dismissive laugh set in motion a chain of events that would shatter his world. Jensen believed he was the master of his domain, the king of the skies. He had no idea he had just laughed at a ghost from his past, the very man who had forged him, the instructor who held the key to his future, and the architect of a karmic lesson he was about to learn at 39,000 feet. This isn't just a story about a flight, it's about a fall from grace and the crushing weight of a past you can never outfly. The cockpit of the Boeing 777 was Mark Jensen's throne room. From the plush, sheepskin-covered captain's chair, he surveyed his kingdom. Below, the intricate dance of ground crews, baggage handlers, and fuel trucks played out under the harsh morning lights of John F. Kennedy International Airport. Inside, the sterile, organized environment of the flight deck, with its hundreds of glowing dials, screens, and switches, responded to his every command. At 42, Captain Mark Jensen was exactly where he believed he deserved to be, in command of the most prestigious transatlantic route for Global Atlantic Airways. He wasn't just a pilot, he was an artist of aviation. His landings were legendary, so smooth that passengers often didn't realize they were on the ground until the spoilers deployed. His command of procedure was flawless, his voice over the intercom a buttery baritone that radiated unshakable confidence. He had a chiseled jaw, steel blue eyes, and a full head of sandy blonde hair that he kept perfectly styled, even after a 9-hour flight. He was the poster boy for the airline, and he knew it. This morning, sitting to his right was First Officer Alex Miller, a young, eager pilot in his late 20s who still looked at Mark with a degree of hero worship. "Pre-flight checklist complete, Captain. All systems green," Alex reported, his voice crisp and professional. "As they should be, Alex. As they always should be," Mark replied without looking at him, his gaze fixed on the passenger jet bridge connecting to their aircraft. Perfection is the only acceptable standard. Mark's father had been a decorated pilot for the same airline, a titan of the 747 era. Mark had grown up with the scent of jet fuel in his nostrils and the expectation of greatness in his ears. He hadn't just met that expectation, he'd surpassed it, earning his captaincy years ahead of schedule. But this legacy had also instilled in him a deep-seated arrogance, a belief that his place in the world was preordained, earned not just through skill, but through birthright. He saw the world in a clear hierarchy, and he was firmly at the top. The boarding process began. Mark would often watch the first-class passengers embark, a silent ritual of judgment. He saw them as members of his exclusive club, CEOs, celebrities, old money. He recognized a tech billionaire and a senator, nodding to himself in approval. This was his crowd. Then he saw him. An older black man, likely in his early 70s, was walking down the jet bridge. He was dressed in a well-worn but clean tweed jacket, simple trousers, and comfortable-looking leather shoes. He carried a small, soft-sided carry-on and walked with a steady, unhurried gait. There was a quiet dignity about him, a calmness in his dark, intelligent eyes. He held a first-class ticket, but to Mark, he looked utterly out of place. Mark leaned over to Alex, a smirk playing on his lips. "Take a look at 2A, he murmured, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Must be a diversity initiative from the marketing department. Gotta fill those quotas, even in first class." Alex glanced out and saw the man handing his ticket to the flight attendant. He didn't see what Mark saw. He saw a grandfatherly figure, perhaps a retired professor or a doctor. He gave a non-committal shrug. "He looks like a nice old gentleman, sir." Mark chuckled. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh, but a short, sharp burst of condescending air. It was a sound of derision, a private joke at the expense of someone he deemed lesser. "Right. A gentleman. Probably won his ticket on a game show." The comment hung in the air, souring the sterile environment of the cockpit. Alex felt a pang of discomfort. He admired Captain Jensen's skill, but his arrogance could be grating. This felt different, though. It was needlessly cruel. Before Alex could formulate a response, the lead flight attendant, Sarah, buzzed the cockpit. "Captain, boarding is complete. Cabin is secure and ready for departure." Mark straightened up, his professional mask snapping back into place. The smirk was gone, replaced by the cool, confident expression of Captain Jensen. "Thank you, Sarah. Cockpit to ground. We are clear to disconnect," he said, his voice once again the familiar, reassuring baritone. As the tug pushed them back from the gate, Mark's mind had already dismissed the passenger in 2A. He was an insignificant anomaly, a footnote in the otherwise perfect narrative of his morning. He had a flight to command, an ocean to cross. He was the king of the skies, and from his throne, the world was a very small, very simple place. He had no way of knowing that the quiet man in the tweed jacket, the subject of his casual cruelty, had once commanded skies far more dangerous than these and held the power to bring Mark's entire kingdom crashing down around him. The flight to London was just beginning, but Captain Jensen's descent had already begun. The Boeing 777, under Mark's expert control, sliced through the lower cloud layers and ascended into the brilliant, unforgiving sunlight of the upper atmosphere. Below, Long Island was a green and gray patchwork receding into the vast blue of the Atlantic. The flight was, by all accounts, perfect. The ascent was smooth, the air was calm, and they were ahead of schedule. Inside the cockpit, the routine of transatlantic flight took over. Mark and Alex worked in practiced harmony, monitoring systems, communicating with air traffic control, and running periodic checks. Mark was in his element, a conductor leading a symphony of technology and procedure. About an hour into the flight, as they settled at their cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, a small amber light flickered on the main instrument panel. It was a minor advisory, almost negligible. "Flap control zeswes fault." A fault in the flap control system. Alex pointed to it. "Captain, we have a flap control advisory." Mark glanced at it, his expression one of annoyance rather than concern. "It's a sensor ghost. We see it all the time on the 777-300ERs. The cold air at altitude messes with the number 3 secondary position sensor. Run the diagnostic. It'll clear itself in 20 minutes. He waved a dismissive hand. "It's nothing." "Running the diagnostic," Alex confirmed, his fingers flying across the control panel. He trusted the captain's experience implicitly. Mark had seen everything, but the light didn't clear. After 30 minutes, it remained, a stubborn amber eye staring back at them. The diagnostic check came back inconclusive. "Still there, sir," Alex said, a note of concern creeping into his voice. "System isn't resetting." Mark's jaw tightened. This was an imperfection, a blemish on his flawless flight. "Fine, we'll log it. It's not a no-go item. We can land perfectly fine without the secondary sensor. The primary and tertiary systems are fine. It's a nuisance, nothing more." He decided to step out of the cockpit for a moment to stretch his legs and grab a coffee, leaving Alex to monitor the systems. It was a power move, a display of how unconcerned he was. As he walked through the hushed first-class cabin, he happened to pass by seat 2A. The old man was not watching a movie or sleeping. He had a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading it. His head was tilted slightly as if he were listening, not to the conversations or the hum of the cabin, but to the aircraft itself. As Mark passed, the man's eyes met his for a brief moment. They were sharp, analytical, and unnervingly perceptive. Mark gave a curt, professional nod and continued to the galley. There, the lead flight attendant, Sarah, was preparing the coffee. "Everything all right up front, Captain?" she asked. "You seem a bit tense." "Just a minor sensor glitch. Annoying but harmless," Mark said, leaning against the counter. "This aircraft has more redundancies than a government committee." At that moment, the passenger from 2A stood up and made his way toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin. As he passed the galley, he paused. He looked at Mark, not with intimidation, but with a quiet, level gaze. "Captain," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble. "Pardon my interruption." Mark turned, surprised that a passenger would address him so directly. "Can I help you?" "I happened to overhear your conversation with the flight attendant," the man said, gesturing vaguely towards the cockpit. "The flap control fault, Is it the number 3 secondary sensor on the outboard trailing edge? Mark's confident demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. He was stunned. How could this passenger possibly know such a specific technical detail? It wasn't public knowledge. He quickly regained his composure, mistaking the man's insight for the meddling of an amateur aviation enthusiast. That's classified flight information, Mark said coolly, his voice laced with condescension. And I can assure you, sir, my first officer and I have the situation completely under control. I'd appreciate it if you'd return to your seat and enjoy the flight. The old man didn't flinch. He simply held Mark's gaze. I'm aware. I just know that on this model, a persistent fault in that specific sensor isn't always a ghost. It can sometimes indicate a potential hydraulic fluid leak, a slow one, from the actuator assembly. The cold air makes the seals contract and can exacerbate a microscopic fissure. It won't show on the main hydraulic gauges until it's significant. He added, it's a 1 in 1,000 chance, but the checklist for a persistent, non-clearing fault might be worth a second look. The sheer, unadulterated technical accuracy of the statement was like a physical blow. Mark was speechless. This wasn't an enthusiast. This was an expert. But his pride, his immense, suffocating pride, refused to acknowledge it. Who was this old man in a tweed jacket to school him on his own aircraft? He forced a tight, dismissive smile. Thank you for your input, he said, the words dripping with sarcasm. But we follow our own procedures. We're the professionals here. Now, if you'll excuse me. He turned his back on the man, took his coffee from Sarah, and walked back toward the cockpit, his posture ramrod straight. But inside, his mind was racing. Hydraulic fluid leak, actuator assembly, microscopic fissure. The terms were not just correct, they were hyper-specific. It was the kind of knowledge a design engineer or a senior maintenance technician would have, not some random passenger. He slammed the cockpit door shut behind him, the sound echoing the turmoil in his head. Everything okay, Captain? Alex asked, noticing his agitated state. Perfectly fine, Mark snapped. Just had to deal with a passenger who thinks he's an expert because he read a book once. But the seed of doubt had been planted. He sat back in his chair, the amber light of the fault indicator seeming to mock him. He pulled up the expanded maintenance logs on his tablet, his fingers moving furiously. He told himself he was just being thorough, but he knew the truth. The old man's words had unsettled him, digging under his skin like a splinter. For the first time in a long time, on his own flight deck, Captain Mark Jensen felt a flicker of uncertainty, and he hated it. For the next 2 hours, an uneasy silence permeated the cockpit, broken only by the necessary and clipped exchanges with air traffic control. Mark Jensen stared ahead at the endless blue horizon, but his mind was miles away, replaying the old man's words. A potential hydraulic fluid leak. The suggestion was preposterous, yet delivered with such quiet authority that it had burrowed deep into his professional consciousness. He'd cross-referenced the maintenance logs twice. There was nothing. His initial assessment stood. It was a sensor ghost. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being judged by a knowledge greater than his own. Alex Miller, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own curiosity. He'd witnessed the exchange in the galley from a distance, seeing the captain's dismissive posture and the old man's unnerving calm. He had also heard the passenger's specific technical reference as he re-entered the cockpit. It was far beyond the scope of a typical armchair pilot. Who was this man? Driven by an instinct he couldn't quite explain, Alex decided to do some digging. It was against protocol to look up personal details of passengers, but the flight manifest was accessible on his company-issued tablet. He discreetly opened the file. Passenger seat 2A, Sterling, David. The name meant nothing to him. He ran a quick search on the airline's high-value passenger list. No results. Mr. David Sterling was not a known celebrity, politician, or corporate titan. He was just a name. Alex's curiosity was now a full-blown obsession. Using the aircraft's satellite Wi-Fi, which was slow and intended for operational use only, he typed the name into a search engine. David Sterling pilot. The first few results were generic. There were thousands of David Sterlings in the world. He refined the search. David Sterling aviation instructor. The results narrowed. A few articles popped up. One was a small press release from a regional flight school in Ohio. Another was a LinkedIn profile for a corporate jet pilot. Nothing seemed to fit. He was about to give up when he tried a different combination. Commander David Sterling Aviation. The screen refreshed, and there it was. The first hit was a feature article from Aviation Weekly magazine, dated 5 years ago. The headline read, "The Eagle's Mentor, Commander Sterling retires after 50 years in the sky." Alex's breath caught in his throat. He clicked the link. The page loaded slowly, but the lead photo was unmistakable. It was a younger version of the man in 2A, perhaps in his late 60s, standing in front of a T-45 Goshawk training jet. He was wearing a Navy flight suit, his posture exuding an authority that transcended rank. His eyes, even in the photograph, were the same, sharp, calm, and deeply intelligent. Alex began to read, his own eyes widening with every sentence. Commander David Merlin Sterling, a living legend in naval aviation, is hanging up his G-suit. With a career spanning 5 decades, Sterling's influence on modern military and civilian piloting is immeasurable. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, he flew F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam, accumulating over 300 combat missions and earning 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses. He later became one of the first African-American instructors at the elite Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, where he was instrumental in rewriting the curriculum for air combat maneuvering in the jet age. Alex felt a cold chill creep up his spine. Top Gun. He scrolled down, his heart pounding against his ribs. The article continued. After retiring from the Navy, Sterling didn't slow down. He took a position as the chief flight instructor at the prestigious Phoenix Flight Academy in Arizona, the very institution that trains pilots for a dozen major airlines, including Global Atlantic Airways. For 20 years, he was the final gatekeeper. Every pilot candidate, regardless of their background, had to pass Commander Sterling's final check ride. A grueling in-flight examination known for breaking even the most confident aviators. He didn't just teach pilots how to fly, he taught them how to think, how to lead, and how to respect the machine. His mantra was famous among his students. The sky doesn't care about your ego, it only cares about your skill and your humility. The article listed some of the airlines whose pilots were trained under his watch. Global Atlantic Airways was at the top of the list. A sickening realization washed over Alex. He looked at the dates. Commander Sterling had been the chief instructor at Phoenix Flight Academy for 20 years, retiring just 5 years ago. Captain Mark Jensen had come up through the Phoenix program. It wasn't just possible, it was a certainty. The man Captain Jensen had derided as a game show winner, the man he had condescendingly dismissed as an amateur, was not just an expert, he was the expert. He was the legend who had trained and certified a generation of pilots. He was the man who had personally signed off on Mark Jensen's right to sit in that very captain's chair. Alex felt his world tilt on its axis. The casual cruelty he'd witnessed earlier was now magnified into a monstrous act of hubris and disrespect. The quiet laugh in the cockpit was an echo of a much larger, more profound ignorance. Jensen hadn't just insulted a passenger, he had spat in the face of his own history, of the very institution that had given him his wings. He looked over at Mark, who was now moodily staring at the amber fault light, his arrogance having curdled into a quiet petulance. Mark was oblivious, wrapped in the cocoon of his own self-importance. Alex's mind raced. Should he say something? What could he even say? Captain, that man you laughed at and then belittled in the galley? He's basically the Yoda of modern aviation, and in all likelihood, your former instructor. The thought was terrifying. An accusation of that magnitude could create a rift in the cockpit, a dangerous situation at 39,000 feet. But the silence felt even more dangerous. It felt like a lie. The truth was sitting there, on his tablet screen, a ticking time bomb. The hierarchy of the cockpit was absolute, but there was a higher authority at play here. The authority of legacy, of respect, of undeniable and legendary expertise. Alex closed the tablet, his hands trembling slightly. He looked from his captain's oblivious profile to the stubborn amber light on the console, and he knew this flight would not end with a smooth landing in London. It would end with a reckoning, and he was sitting right in the middle of it. The atmosphere in the cockpit grew thick and heavy, the low hum of the engines and the whisper of the wind over the fuselage amplifying the suffocating silence between the two pilots. Alex Miller felt as if he were holding a live grenade. The knowledge he possessed was too explosive to keep to himself, yet the very act of revealing it felt like pulling the pin. For another hour, he warred with himself, rehearsing and discarding a dozen different ways to broach the subject. Finally, as the coast of Ireland appeared on the navigation display, a faint green smudge against the deep blue of the Atlantic, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The descent into London's busy airspace would require flawless communication and teamwork. He couldn't go into that critical phase of flight with this colossal unspoken truth hanging between them. He took a deep breath. "Captain?" Mark grunted in response, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "What is it, Miller?" "It's about the passenger in 2A, the man who spoke to you in the galley." Mark finally turned his head, his blue eyes cold and impatient. "What about him? I hope he hasn't filed a complaint because his ego was bruised. I have no time for passenger theatrics." "No, sir, it's not that," Alex said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. I recognized him. His name is David Sterling." Mark stared at him blankly. The name registered, but without context it meant nothing. "And? Am I supposed to know who David Sterling is?" Here it was, the point of no return. "He was the chief flight instructor at Phoenix Flight Academy, sir. He retired about 5 years ago." The change in Mark Jensen's demeanor was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a switch had been flipped, cutting power to his entire facade of arrogance. The color drained from his face, his confident posture slackened, and his eyes, which moments before had been full of dismissive pride, were now wide with dawning horror. He swiveled his chair to face Alex fully. "What did you just say?" he whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Commander David Merlin Sterling," Alex repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "He trained global Atlantic pilots for 20 years. He was a combat pilot, a Top Gun instructor. He was the final check ride." Mark didn't respond. He just stared at Alex, his mouth slightly agape. The name Merlin was like a key, unlocking a flood of memories he had long suppressed. He remembered a formidable, unsmiling figure from his academy days. A man whose reputation was the stuff of legend and terror. A man who could fail a student for a single sloppy maneuver or a moment of overconfidence. A man whose approval they all craved and feared in equal measure. He remembered the grueling check ride, the sweat dripping down his back, as a calm, authoritative voice from the co-pilot's seat questioned his every decision. He remembered the final, terse sign-off. "You'll do, Jensen. Don't get cocky." He had forgotten the face over the years, but he had never forgotten the presence, and now that presence was sitting 30 feet behind him in a tweed jacket. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. The quiet dignity, the analytical gaze, the impossibly specific technical knowledge about the flap actuator, and worst of all, Mark's own actions. The condescending smirk, the whispered joke about quotas, the dismissive wave of his hand, the sarcastic, patronizing lecture in the galley. He felt a wave of nausea. The king of the skies had just discovered he was nothing more than a court jester, performing his foolish act in front of the silent, watching emperor. Are you sure?" Mark stammered, clinging to a final, desperate thread of denial. "I'm positive, sir," Alex said, unlocking his tablet and pulling up the Aviation Weekly article. He held it out for Mark to see. Mark stared at the photo of a younger Commander Sterling, standing proudly in his flight suit. There was no doubt. The eyes were the same. Those calm, all-seeing eyes that had judged him 20 years ago were the same eyes that had watched him make a fool of himself just a few hours prior. He leaned back in his chair, the blood roaring in his ears. The cockpit, his sanctuary, his throne room, suddenly felt like a cage. Every switch, every gauge, every system he had mastered, he had learned under the shadow of the man he had just insulted. The wings on his chest felt heavy, fraudulent. "Oh, God," he breathed, the words barely audible. He put a hand to his forehead, his carefully constructed world collapsing in on him. The flight wasn't perfect anymore. It was a catastrophe. His career, his reputation, his self-image, all of it felt fragile. on the verge of shattering. He looked over at the amber fault light, the source of his initial annoyance. It was no longer just a technical glitch. It was a symbol of his own blindness, a glowing beacon of his hubris. Commander Sterling hadn't been an interfering passenger. He had been a mentor, even in that moment, offering a piece of quiet, life-saving wisdom born of 50 years of experience. And Mark had thrown it back in his face. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't tense, it was funereal. The sound of Mark Jensen's pride dying. For the rest of the flight, as they began their descent into the crowded London airspace, Mark was a changed man. His movements were robotic. His voice when he spoke to air traffic control was devoid of its usual confident flourish. He was just a pilot going through the motions, a ghost in his own cockpit. The king was dead. All that was left was a man haunted by a single, condescending laugh. The landing at Heathrow was technically flawless. Mark Jensen, operating on muscle memory and years of training, guided the 200-ton aircraft onto the runway with his signature smoothness. The wheels kissed the tarmac with barely a shudder, but for the first time in his career, he felt no satisfaction, no thrill of a job well done. The precision of his actions was a hollow echo of the professional he thought he was. Each movement was a reminder of the man who had taught him that precision, the man he had so casually disrespected. As they taxied to the gate, the mood in the cockpit was somber. Alex handled the final shutdown procedures, his movements efficient, his face unreadable. He felt a strange mix of pity and vindication. He hadn't wanted this to happen, but he knew a lesson needed to be learned. When the engine spooled down into silence and the fasten seatbelt sign was extinguished, Mark undid his harness. He didn't move to gather his things. He just sat there, staring at the inert controls. "Alex," he said, his voice low and strained. "Thank you." "For what, Captain?" "For telling me. For not letting me make it to London in ignorance." Alex simply nodded. "You have to go talk to him, sir." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. Mark knew it was true. This couldn't be left unresolved. The thought of facing Commander Sterling filled him with a dread far worse than any in-flight emergency he had ever encountered. It was the terror of facing a judge you knew had already found you guilty. He unbuckled himself and stood up, straightening his uniform jacket. It felt like a costume he was no longer worthy of wearing. He opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. The passengers were beginning to deplane, a slow procession of sleepy travelers gathering their belongings. His eyes immediately found seat 2A. Commander Sterling was waiting patiently, allowing the others in his row to exit first. He was calm, unhurried, as if he knew this moment was coming. As Mark approached, Sterling looked up, and their eyes met. There was no anger in the old man's gaze, no hint of triumph. There was only a profound and heavy disappointment. Mark stopped at his row, his heart pounding. The bustling cabin seemed to fade away, the sounds of zippers and conversations melting into a dull roar. There were just the two of them. "Commander Sterling," Mark began, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, He trailed off, the prepared apologies dying on his lips. What could he say? "I'm sorry I'm a fool. I'm sorry my ego is so large it has its own gravitational pull." Sterling saved him from his floundering. "It's Captain Jensen now, isn't it?" he said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been in the galley. "You made it. I remember your check ride. You had good hands. A natural stick and rudder man. A little arrogant, but I figured you'd grow out of it." The last sentence landed like a physical blow. I figured you'd grow out of it. He hadn't. He had grown into it, nurtured it, let it become the defining feature of his personality. "Sir, I am so deeply, profoundly sorry," Mark managed to say, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "My behavior was inexcusable. My comments, my attitude. There is no excuse. I was unprofessional and I was disrespectful. To you and to the uniform I wear." Commander Sterling listened, his expression unchanging. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Apology accepted, Captain." Mark felt a small, fleeting wave of relief, but it was quickly washed away by what Sterling said next. But I don't think you understand what you should be sorry for, the old man continued, his voice dropping slightly, drawing Mark in. You're sorry because you got caught. You're sorry because you insulted someone who, it turns out, used to be your superior. That's just embarrassment, Captain. It's wounded pride. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into Mark's. You should be sorry for the pilot you've become. I taught you that the 4 stripes on your shoulder aren't a crown. They're a responsibility to your crew, to your passengers, and to the integrity of that cockpit. You judged a man based on the jacket he was wearing and the color of his skin. You dismissed valid technical input because your ego couldn't handle being questioned. What if I hadn't been your old instructor? What if I was just a knowledgeable passenger trying to help? Your arrogance would have dismissed me just the same. That's the real danger, Captain. That's the flaw in your character that will, one day, lead to a catastrophe. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the last remnants of Mark's self-deception. The sky doesn't care about your ego, Jensen, Sterling said, quoting the same mantra Alex had read in the article. It was a phrase Mark now vaguely remembered hearing 20 years ago. Today, the fault was a sensor. Tomorrow, it might be something more. And when that day comes, I hope you're listening to the airplane and your crew, not to the sound of your own pride. With that, Commander Sterling picked up his small carry-on bag, stood up, and moved past Mark into the aisle. He paused for a moment beside him. You still have good hands, Mark, he said, his voice softening for the first time. Don't let a bad character ruin a good pilot. And then he was gone, disappearing into the stream of deplaning passengers, leaving Captain Mark Jensen standing alone in the first-class cabin, a broken king in an empty kingdom. The apology had been given and accepted, but it wasn't an absolution. It was a verdict. And Mark knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the sentence was yet to come. The weeks following the flight to London were a strange, hollow purgatory for Mark Jensen. He continued to fly, his movements as precise as ever, his voice over the intercom as smooth. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside, everything was different. The cockpit no longer felt like his throne room. It felt like a glass house. Every decision he made was shadowed by the memory of Commander Sterling's words. You should be sorry for the pilot you've become. He hoped the incident was behind him. Commander Sterling was a man of immense class. Mark was certain he wouldn't file a formal complaint. He had delivered his judgment personally and left it at that. Mark believed he had been given a second chance, a terrifying wake-up call that he was determined to heed. He was more collaborative with Alex, more respectful to the cabin crew. He was trying to change. What Mark didn't know was that the event had not gone unwitnessed. There were other eyes and ears on Flight 110. Sarah Jenkins, the lead flight attendant, had been deeply troubled by the entire affair. She had heard Mark's initial sarcastic remarks about the passenger in 2A. She had witnessed the condescending and dismissive way he had treated the old man in the galley. Later, she saw the captain's pale, shaken face as he went to apologize after landing. She didn't know the whole story, but she knew enough. She had seen a captain whose arrogance had compromised his professionalism, creating a tense and uncomfortable atmosphere. For 2 weeks, she debated what to do. Filing a report against a senior captain like Mark Jensen was a risky career move. But her flight attendant training was clear. Any behavior that could potentially affect flight safety or crew cohesion had to be reported. With a heavy heart, she logged into the company's internal reporting system, a confidential portal for safety and conduct concerns. She wrote a careful, detailed, and objective report. She didn't mention race or speculate on motives. She simply described the events as she saw them. Captain Jensen making derogatory comments about a passenger to his first officer, which were overheard. Captain Jensen publicly dismissing a passenger who offered technical advice in a patronizing manner, and a palpable tension in the captain's demeanor for the remainder of the flight. She submitted it, feeling a mix of professional duty and personal anxiety. Across the Atlantic, another report was being considered. First Officer Alex Miller was also in a difficult position. He was the captain's subordinate, and the cockpit was a sacred space. But what he had witnessed was more than just a personal failing. It was a crisis of command. A captain who lets his personal prejudice cloud his judgment is a liability. The fact that the passenger turned out to be Commander Sterling was a dramatic twist. But the core problem would have existed even if he had been an anonymous engineer. Alex believed in the system. He believed in the principles he had been taught, principles instilled in him by instructors at Phoenix, men and women who had learned from Commander Sterling himself. He, too, filed a report. His was more detailed, including the initial comment about diversity initiatives and the full context of the later revelation. He framed it not as a personal attack on Jensen, but as a concern for the command culture at Global Atlantic. Neither Sarah nor Alex knew the other had filed a report. They acted independently, guided by their own professional compasses. At the Global Atlantic corporate headquarters in New York, these two confidential reports landed on the desk of Mr. Richard Harrison, the formidable vice president of flight operations. Harrison was a no-nonsense executive, a former pilot himself who viewed his fleet of captains as the guardians of his company's billion-dollar reputation. One report against a senior captain was concerning. Two independent, corroborating reports about the same incident from two different crew members, one cockpit, one cabin, was a 5-alarm fire. Harrison initiated a top-level internal investigation. He pulled the cockpit voice recorder logs, which are routinely saved for a short period for quality control. The initial whispered comment from Jensen to Miller was there, faint but clear. He pulled Jensen's personnel file. It was filled with commendations for his flying skills, but there were also a few minor, previously overlooked notes from junior officers over the years, mentioning his overly confident and dismissive attitude. A pattern began to emerge. The name on the passenger manifest, David Sterling, also caught Harrison's attention. He was an aviation man through and through. He knew exactly who Commander Sterling was. He felt a knot form in his stomach. One of his top captains had insulted a living legend, a man to whom the entire industry owed a debt of gratitude. This was not just unprofessionalism, it was a profound embarrassment to the airline. Mark Jensen was completely unaware of the storm gathering around him. He was on a layover in Hong Kong when he received the email. It was curt and formal. Captain Jensen, upon your return to New York, you are required to attend a mandatory meeting with Richard Harrison, VP of Flight Operations. Your flight schedule has been cleared for the remainder of the week. Do not fly until this meeting has concluded. Mark's blood ran cold. Do not fly. Those were the four most terrifying words in a pilot's vocabulary. He knew with a sickening certainty that this was not about a second chance. This was about the sentence. The unseen reports had done their work, and karma, flying silently on the wings of corporate procedure, was finally coming into land. The walk to Richard Harrison's office on the top floor of the Global Atlantic Tower felt like a condemned man's final mile. The executive floor was a world away from the functional, lived-in environment of an airport. Here the air was still and cool, scented with the faint, expensive smell of leather and success. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of his polished shoes, making his advance unnervingly silent. His own reflection, distorted in the gleaming chrome of the elevator doors, showed a man he barely recognized, a captain in full uniform, yet stripped of all the authority it was meant to convey. His face was a pale, taut mask of anxiety. He was a pilot, a man whose entire life was defined by control, procedure, and a clear view of the horizon. Now he was utterly powerless, walking blindly into a storm of his own making. Harrison's office was designed to intimidate. It was a vast corner suite with a wall of glass that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the JFK runways. From this height, the colossal Boeing 777s and Airbus A380s looked like graceful toys, their takeoffs and landings a steady, silent ballet. It was Mark's world, his kingdom, and he was viewing it from the executioner's block. Richard Harrison was standing by the window, his back to the door, observing the airfield. He was a man carved from granite, a former B-52 pilot who had transitioned into the corporate world without losing an ounce of his military command. He didn't turn when Mark entered. "Look at them, Jensen," Harrison said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. "Every single one of those aircraft is a promise of safety, of professionalism, of trust. We don't just sell seats from New York to London. We sell the absolute certainty that the people in charge are the best in the world. Flawless, infallible. He finally turned, and his piercing, hawk-like eyes fixed on Mark. You broke that promise. He gestured to a single, hard-backed chair placed precisely in the center of the room, far from the mahogany desk. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. Mark sat, his posture rigid. Harrison walked to his desk but didn't sit behind it. Instead, he leaned against the edge, towering over Mark. He picked up a thin file. I have here two independent, unsolicited incident reports from Flight 110 on September 28th. One from the cabin, one from the cockpit. They corroborate each other perfectly. He let the file drop onto the desk with a sharp, final sound. Then I have the cockpit voice recorder logs. It's all there, Captain. The charming little remark about diversity initiatives. The condescending dismissal of a passenger offering specific, accurate technical advice. The entire ugly story of a captain whose ego is flying the plane. Mark's throat was dry. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to frame the apology he had given to Sterling as a proof of his remorse. Sir, I can explain. I spoke to Commander Sterling after the flight. I apologized. Harrison let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. You apologize because your co-pilot figured out you just insulted a living legend? Your apology was an act of self-preservation, not character. That you don't see the difference is the entire problem. He pushed himself off the desk and began to pace slowly. I've reviewed your entire record, Mark. You are a brilliant pilot. Your technical skills are in the top 1%. You have the best hands in the fleet, but your character has not kept pace. There's a pattern of minor complaints, of first officers feeling dismissed, of an arrogance that we, as a company, have mistaken for confidence. That ends today. This was it, the final moment. So I'm terminated, Mark stated, the words tasting like ash. Harrison stopped pacing and stared directly at him. No, firing you is easy. It allows you to walk away with your narrative intact. The brilliant pilot wronged by corporate politics. It allows you to become a martyr in your own mind. No, Captain, you don't get to walk away. You're going to stay, and you're going to fix the damage you've caused. A confusing flicker of hope mixed with a new kind of dread ignited in Mark's chest. You are hereby grounded from all passenger flights, effective immediately, Harrison declared, his voice cold and absolute. Your name is off the roster. You will be assigned to ground duty, simulator checks, and remedial coursework. For all intents and purposes, you are a trainee again. The 4 stripes on your shoulder are now provisional. You will earn them back, or you will never command a global Atlantic aircraft again. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him, taking his breath away. He would be a ghost at the company, the fallen captain haunting the training centers. But Harrison hadn't delivered the final, killing blow. He returned to his desk, steepling his fingers. This incident has highlighted a systemic risk I can no longer ignore: complacency, arrogance in our senior pilots. Therefore, the board has approved a new, mandatory program, the Captain's Character Initiative. It's an intensive leadership and crisis management course for all senior flight staff. Mark listened, his mind numb. It was just more corporate training, another hoop to jump through. To run such a program, Harrison continued, his voice dropping strategically, we needed someone with unimpeachable moral and professional authority, someone who couldn't be dismissed or charmed, a legend whose very presence would force even the most arrogant pilot to listen. We needed a man who embodies the very principles you seem to have forgotten, Captain. Harrison paused, letting the silence stretch, building the tension with an artist's precision. Mark's mind raced, but he couldn't fathom who it could be. It was a long shot. The man we wanted is retired, but I called him personally. I explained the situation, without using your name, of course. I told him we had a problem with the culture of command itself. When he heard that, he felt it was his duty to help. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Mark's, leaving no room for escape. Your first class for the Captain's Character Initiative is next Monday at 800 hours. Your lead instructor, the man who will personally evaluate your progress, the man whose signature will be required on the form that clears you to fly again, is Commander David Sterling. The world dissolved. The panoramic view of the runways tilted and blurred. The sound in the room faded to a dull roar in Mark's ears. It was a checkmate so perfect, so poetically just, that it felt like an invention of fiction. He was trapped. His entire career, his future, was now in the hands of the man he had ridiculed. He would not just be Sterling's student, he would be his project, his case study in failure. The karma was not a lightning strike, it was a cage meticulously constructed and quietly locked. The following Monday, Mark Jensen walked into the Advanced Training Center. His uniform felt hollow. He had been forced to remove the 4 stripes from his epaulets, leaving only the faint outline where they had been sewn. He was no longer a captain. He was just a pilot. He took a seat in the very back corner of the classroom, hoping to disappear. The room was filled with other senior captains, men he had flown with for years, their faces a mixture of resentment and grudging compliance. At precisely 8 a.m., the door opened. Commander David Sterling walked in, holding a simple leather-bound folder. He wore a crisp, navy blue instructor's polo in simple trousers. He didn't carry a commanding presence. He was a commanding presence. A hush fell over the room. He walked to the podium at the front, placed his folder down, and looked out at the faces before him. His eyes scanned the room, acknowledging each pilot. Finally, they found Mark in the back corner. Their gazes locked across the space, and for a long, 10-second eternity, the world stood still. There was no anger in Sterling's eyes, no vindication, no triumph. There was only the profound, heavy, and unwavering expectation of a teacher looking at a student who had everything to learn. Mark Jensen lowered his head, not in shame, but in the silent, humbling acknowledgement that his real training was, at last, about to begin. The story of Captain Mark Jensen and Commander David Sterling isn't just about a dramatic encounter at 39,000 feet. It's a powerful, real-world lesson in humility and the insidious nature of casual prejudice. It reminds us that the stripes on our shoulders or the titles on our business cards are not a shield against the flaws in our character. True authority isn't about arrogance or command, it's about respect. Respect for others, respect for your craft, and respect for the quiet wisdom that can come from the most unexpected places. Mark Jensen's hard karma wasn't just losing his command. It was being forced to confront his own reflection in the eyes of the man he wronged and having to earn back his own self-respect, one lesson at a time. This story shows that sometimes the hardest landings happen not on a runway, but within our own souls. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might appreciate this powerful message. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that explore the depths of human nature. And let me ask you in the comments below, what would you have done if you were First Officer Alex Miller in that cockpit? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening.